817 cases of coronavirus in Victoria. That is 25 new cases since our last update. 14 of those are linked to known outbreaks. 1 is in hotel quarantine. 6 are as a result of routine testing, and 4 are still being investigated. We have done more than 645,000 tests. 9,504 yesterday, 14,000 approximately the day before, so just in the last couple of days, more than 23,000 tests. And our testing regime remains among one of the highest rates per 100,000 people anywhere in the world. Can I just add one further comment to the breakdown of those 25 cases? We do anticipate, although there'll be further work done by our public health team, that some of the 6 that are a result of routine testing will in fact finish up being linked to known outbreaks. But they are the numbers as they stand now. Now, I want to make a few comments in general terms and talk about some of the challenges, the essential problem that we have underlying these numbers, and then I've got some announcements to make in relation to changes to our restriction easing timeline and sadly some restrictions that we will need to reimpose on every single Victorian family. First things first, we have always followed the advice of our public health experts, and that is what has helped us to avoid absolute disaster from a health point of view. It is what gets us into a position that, whilst today's numbers and very recent trends are very challenging and problematic, we have avoided so many of those horror scenes from so many other parts of the world. That advice is critically important. That advice has been followed, and it will continue to be followed by our government. However, we have got since April, we have got half of all of our new cases have come from family-to-family transmission. And I want to give you a couple of examples of the sort of conduct, the sort of behaviour that we have seen. And I'm frustrated by it, I'm disappointed by it, but it's appropriate that we be really upfront and describe it so people can understand what's driving these numbers. We've had cases of people gathering in large numbers, even though at their home or another family member's home or a close friend's home, even though they had been told to isolate in their own home. We have even had people who have tested positive and have been told to go home and isolate, and instead they have gone to work. Instead they have gone and visited loved ones in large numbers. We have had many stories, numerous stories, of families that have given it to each other and have then transmitted the virus to other families who in turn have passed it on to a third group. It is unacceptable that families anywhere in our state can, just because they want this to be over, pretend that it is. It is not over. And whilst public settings where there is a degree of formality and structure, for instance, no one is greeting anybody with a hug or a kiss or a handshake in a cafe or a restaurant, it is pretty clear that behind closed doors, when one family comes together in large numbers and potentially goes and visits another family, they are not practicing social distancing. They are not in a controlled environment. And then there is the circumstances I've alluded to where people are not following the health advice. Actual positive cases who, rather than quarantining at home, have chose to act in a very different way. Now, this is not about blame. It's not about those sorts of issues. They are the facts of the matter, and Victorians are entitled to know that that's what's driving about half the new cases. Transmission within families, transmission from one family to another as a kind of extended family, if you like. Therefore, the first thing I have to announce is that from midnight tomorrow night until midnight Sunday the 12th of July, all household gatherings can be no bigger than those who live in the household and a maximum of 5 guests. I take no pleasure in having to impose that new rule, but unless we can break this cycle of people who are unwell, have symptoms, or even have a positive test, or are a close contact of someone who has a positive test, ignoring the requirements to isolate and instead going and socialising, then we are going to see more and more of these cases. And that ultimately puts everything that we have built, everything that we have achieved as a state, a unified state working together, at risk. And I simply won't allow that to happen. Similarly, from midnight tomorrow night, running until midnight the 12th of July, public gatherings other than those that are listed on the sheet that you've been given, so restaurants and cafes for instance, will be a maximum of 10 people. I can't have a situation where a gathering in your home is high risk and then that is simply taken to the park or to another public place where, regardless of whether it's inside or outside, it remains an unreasonable risk. Thirdly, I have to announce that the planned opening up of, for instance, pubs, restaurants and cafes going from 20 patrons per enclosed space to 50 patrons per enclosed space has been deferred until midnight the 12th of July. Each of these changes relate to that 3-week period. 3 weeks, of course, being the full life cycle of this virus, where we think that we get the best and clearest picture of exactly what's going on out in the community. However, those activities that were scheduled to recommence for the first time at midnight tomorrow night, so for instance gyms opening for the first time, they will be permitted to open as we had planned. Again, this is all based on advice and based on looking at the risks and the proportional benefits and risks of each and any one of these actions, as well as the cumulative impact of these changes. So those things that were slated to recommence for the first time tomorrow night, they will go ahead. But those things that were intended to expand, for instance, restaurants from 20 to 50, that has essentially been deferred for 3 weeks. Now, on the issue of what might be driving some of this family behaviour, where people go to work even though they are unwell, it is, I think, clear that there are some people in the community that perhaps don't have access to sick leave, for instance. Their employment may well be tenuous. They are facing hardship of one source or one cause or another. It is our view that we have to try and remove that barrier where people are, sadly, making the choice that public health is less important than the welfare and the survival, in a financial sense, of their family. They're wrong to make that judgment, but I can appreciate that that is a judgment that is being made. That's why today we are setting up a hardship fund. Anybody who tests positive and can't go to work or has to isolate because they're a close contact of someone who has tested positive and can't go to work, and for whom other arrangements are not available, then they will be eligible for a $1,500 payment. We will get that message out into the community, and we'll make sure that that notion of having to go to work even though you're putting the health and well-being of others at risk is dealt with via this hardship payment. Now, just finally, before I ask Brett to speak to some of these challenges as well, and then of course we'll take your questions, I also want to foreshadow that I cannot rule out, and I won't rule out, the notion of hotspots where we see substantial community transmission being the subject of lockdowns. It may be the case in the days ahead that we have to move to those local government areas or suburbs where some of this activity has gone on, where we have seen the data tells us a very clear story that there are extra cases and the highest number of cases, we may need to, for instance, reinstitute the stay at home, except for the 4 reasons. We all remember that time. It was deeply frustrating, but it was very effective, and we may need to go back to that setting in given geographical areas. I would make the point, I have had a detailed conversation with the Prime Minister on the way to brief you today, and the notion of geographical restrictions, a lockdown, for instance, in a given area is part of the National Cabinet roadmap to reopening if there are outbreaks, if there are unacceptably high levels of community transmission. Now, I give you these examples in that spirit. They are examples. I am not announcing this today. I would be grateful to you if we didn't cause any undue concern, but if you look at the LGAs where we have the highest number of new positive cases since June, they are in order: Hume with 17 cases, Brimbank with 10 cases, Casey with 7, and then there are a number with 6, Darebin, Moreland and Cardinia. I again stress I am not announcing any changes for those geographical areas right now, but I cannot rule that out. Similarly, we have been doing extensive work because we do acknowledge that there are some, just as there are some parts of the state that have had substantial numbers in recent times, there are many parts of the state, particularly in regional Victoria, that have had no cases and it's fair to say no community transmission whatsoever. We will, if and when it is safe, reopen those communities perhaps with a different set of rules. We do acknowledge there is some complexity that can come from that, but it's not all one way. We will take the appropriate action to deal with these cases and to deal with the virus in terms of harder lockdowns in geographical communities if we believe that's the appropriate step to take. Just at the same time, though, we are also considering where the epidemiology, the way the virus is presenting in communities where there is no transmission, we may well seek to open those communities up a little faster than would otherwise have been the case. I just think if you're considering one, and it's well before that, we were already along the road thinking about whether we might be able to do more in regional Victoria. Now, the reason we would not announce either of those is we need a little more time to see more data come through, and in particular, in relation to regional Victoria potentially having a different set of rules in a more positive sense. We, of course, have the school holidays coming up and there will be a lot of movement around our state. Advice has driven us. Experts have driven us all the way. But you can have the best chief health officer, you can have the best public health team. But if individual families decide that they won't isolate, they will instead go and visit in large numbers other families, then all of that is for nothing. We're all in this together. And whilst I am deeply frustrated by this and saddened to have to reimpose the household gathering limits and to make the decision not to proceed on Monday with a number of further restriction easings, that is the responsible thing to do. If at any point we can be confident that we can change those settings before the 12th of July, of course, we would always look to do that. But each and every step along the way, we have made the point consistently and clearly that every step we took would have to be based on testing, would have to be based on advice, would have to be based on the numbers of positive cases in the Victorian community. My message is very clear. If you are sick, you cannot go out. If you are sick, you cannot go to work. If you are sick, you cannot, even moderate symptoms, mild symptoms, you cannot go and visit family and friends. If you are told to isolate, you must isolate. You cannot make your own decision because it is not your decision to make. You are putting the rest of Victoria at risk. That is not right. That is not the appropriate thing to do. These steps are necessary. They're challenging, they're necessary. I know they will add to frustration in the community. But the one thing that I cannot do, and the one thing that Brett and Jenny cannot do, is join those families in pretending that this is over because we want it to be over. We just can't do that. That would be irresponsible, and that will set us back. That'll put us back where we were right at the beginning, and all the good work will be worth nothing.